I'd like to introduce Neil Chakrabarti, a criminal lawyer, intelligence expert, and advisor for anti-human trafficking organizations combating slavery, working on high-profile murder, drugs, and financial crimes with expertise in behavioral analysis and counterterrorism for the London Metropolitan Police. Councillor, thank you for joining us at this late hour. This is a fairly laid-back affair, so please, in your own time, do address the court. Thank you for being here.
I have prepared something, but it's been very short notice for me, so I'm going to talk about a few things, and I am actually being deployed to Hong Kong for an investigation at the moment. So I'll give you the specifics of that as a segue into the discourse. The first thing I wanted to talk about was the terminology, trafficking and slavery. And that seems to be an umbrella term for a number of different types of slavery trafficking. And the TIP report, which is the Trafficking in Persons report, identifies 7 different types: sex trafficking, child sex trafficking, forced labour, bonded labour or debt bondage, domestic servitude, forced child labour, unlawful recruitment and use of child soldiers. I'm not sure whether there's lawful recruitment, but that's the terminology they've used. So my issue here is conflation. Once you conflate these terms and call it trafficking, it dilutes the understanding and the response. So I wanted to talk about, firstly, why I'm going to Hong Kong. This is an emerging area of exploitation, and it's as an unintended consequence of a policy, which is often the case. So what's happening at the moment in Hong Kong is that there's a number of nannies or au pairs that are being brought in predominantly from the Philippines. And what's happening is agencies from the Philippines are coercing or effectively they're grooming the nannies to go over to Hong Kong. And when the parents are away, they go on to Facebook Live and effectively audition these children. They tell them what to say, what to do to make them provocative, sexually accessible. So one of the main things that I wanted to address, which there is very little empirical studies on, is post-incident behaviours following grooming or pre-incident grooming. So, for instance, the parent who drew attention to this constantly noticed the his 6-year-old daughter trying to grab at his genitalia. This was unusual, obviously, but there is a tendency to explain it away as a normal occurrence, as curiosity or whatever. But if there was a checklist of, these are the behaviours to look out for, then that would be helpful for educating parents and other people that come into contact with these children. But also we need to dismantle the agencies. These agencies are effectively an organised criminal network that are facilitating the exploitation. But what's actually happening is a far more depraved, whereby the Facebook Live is the marketing, if you will, for the child. And then we're looking at the dark web and red rooms, which was initially thought to be a myth, but I can confirm they are true. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with red rooms, but
Please elucidate on this. I think it's very important.
So a red room is it can be found in the dark web, and people subscribe to watch a person being sexually assaulted, a child or being sexually assaulted. Often there are murders, rapes, and there are a number of subscribers. So people all watch at the same time, and they often they direct the person to do certain things to the child or make the child do things. So one of the things we're trying to do is shut them down. That's the Hong Kong issue. So a few months ago, as you probably be aware, this is a separate type of trafficking. A few months ago, an investigation by CNN exposed the horrors of the Libyan slave trade. Probably all familiar with that. It shows footage of men being auctioned for $400. And in April last year, a United Nations agency had already revealed to seemingly deaf ears that hundreds of African migrants and refugees are being sold openly in modern-day slave markets across Libya. But little of any attention was given to this horrific truth. Now, the CNN footage showed irrefutable evidence of this practice, and the world's ears pricked up a little more than it usually does when horrors are being carried out in areas distant to them. Now, one of the quotes that often like from Joseph Conrad, in reference to the Congolese enslavement by the Belgian King Leopold II, was the vilest scramble for loot that ever disfigured the history of human consciousness. Now, the enslavement of the Congolese people occurred well over 100 years ago, but Joseph Conrad would most likely have rescinded that statement if he were to have witnessed the ongoing, relentless, and seemingly inexorable suffering that has persisted since then. The book that he wrote, Hearts of Darkness, was about the Congolese enslavement. This was made into a film which you may have watched, Apocalypse Now. But just to give you an idea of how history reshapes the narrative, they replaced Congo with Vietnam. So very few people know about this issue, but if you look into it further, which I don't have the time to explain, but it's one of the most horrific genocides that's ever taken place. Systematic rape, torture and murder are routine in many areas of the world. Forces responsible for preventing these tragedies are concentrating more on hiding it than addressing it. The CNN investigation penetrated the Chinese walls most governments erect to prevent the world knowing of their failure to act, or worse still, their complicity, and in doing so allowed an entry point to assist these powerless men and women who are subjected to unimaginable horrors. Raising awareness is the premise to change, and guides the collective eyes of the world not simply to the victims, but to the oppressors, and can often shame them into submission, and those who cannot be transformed through shame alone require a different and more robust mechanism for change. The causes behind such a tragedy are, like most sociological phenomena, nuanced and complex, with competing schools of thought either attributing migration, poverty, social media, government corruption, historic oppression, organized crime, or Western foreign policy as being the sole cause of the heart-wrenching acts of human cruelty that we've been made aware of. A cacophony of colliding concepts, with very conceding that the true cause is an amalgam of the above and most likely a lot more. The complexity of the political and cultural landscape obfuscates the potential remedies available, and the internal dispute occurring in the discourse between the policymakers and actors responsible for preventing this humanitarian crisis deepens the trauma. Libya is a hub that many Africans pass through to gain entry to Europe. Africans tempted by the allure of the West are often coaxed away from the poverty and often civil war in their country to the dreams of finding happiness and safety in Europe. The effects of anti-migration sentiment have their own role to play in the slave trade, but independent of this mindset, it is without doubt accepted that there are organized criminal networks who are exploiting men and women in the most sinister way possible. Many flee in panic, leaving all their belongings, whilst others are tricked into paying a smuggler to facilitate entry to Europe with promises that are never delivered, and instead they are either sold as slaves or held hostage for ransom to be paid by their family members. The sociological conflict between compassion fatigue and the democratization of responsibility is at the heart of action or inaction. The majority of people will feel sadness at the Libyan and Myanmar crisis, but that emotion is likely to wean away as the media stop reporting on it and the suffering of distant people become distant memories. Others, almost always the minority, will be motivated to act in some capacity to address the inhumanity. The complexity of the issues requires an unpacking of tangled ideas and then a commitment to which strategy is likely to lead to the most effective change. Another issue, that was two of the issues, but they are completely separate. One is the Hunan scandal. I'm unsure if you're familiar with it, but it involved babies being sold from China to predominantly the US. Approximately 64,000 children were sold, babies. It was under the premise of an unintended consequence of the one-child policy, whereby these babies were abandoned. However, that was revealed not to be true, and these children were forcibly taken from their houses and sold to parents who had no idea. So that's just an idea of three completely different types. However, if we are to look at the one-child policy or the sanctions for not complying with the one-child policy, it did lead to bridal trafficking, whereby there was a disproportionate amount of men in China and they had nobody to marry. So from Cambodia and Laos, they were being trafficked in by fraud or force, and then they were being forced into wedlock. And the fourth type of trafficking that I wanted to talk about, the point of this is to say that they're completely different and the responses should be different, is residential schools in in the US. This is very little coverage has been given to this, and this is state-sponsored. So this would involve the US government going into indigenous tribes, forcibly taking their children, putting them into a boarding school, and the catchphrase used was, kill the Indian, save the man. And it was religiously motivated. So the point here is that the motivations behind trafficking are not necessarily money, they're not necessarily sex, they're different, and the responses need to be different. Now, on a slightly more positive note, the UK have got leading legislation in regards to addressing slavery with the Modern Slavery Act 2015, which is relatively new, but it is we're effectively a pioneer in addressing this issue for one main reason. So Section 1 and 2 effectively address the individual who's carrying out these acts, but Section 54 of the Act holds corporations liable for not preventing it in their supply chain. Supply chain intervention is the key to preventing a type of slavery. So Section 54 requires companies that I think make over 36 million a year to provide an annual report that says what they have done to prevent slavery or trafficking or forced labor, that area. And the equivalence of that, or the ostensible equivalence, because as I'm about to point out, this is not an equivalent at all, is to the onus on corporations to prevent bribery, money laundering, tax evasion, fraud, and the fines for that are unlimited fines and up to 10 years imprisonment. Now, the sanctions for non-compliance with the Modern Slavery Act is an injunction to make you write the statement. No fines, no criminal offences. It effectively means that you can simply, an injunction to say, we write a statement and say we've done everything we could, and that's enough to comply. Now, that's obviously not good enough. Now, there's three different tiers that Trafficking Persons Report identifies as countries, which shows who's doing the most to prevent trafficking. Tier 1 is UK and US, and Tier 2 watch list is Bangladesh, and Tier 3 is China. Now, if you notice, everything that you buy is from generally Bangladesh or China. So what's the relationship between a Tier 1 and a Tier 2 or a Tier 3 country? It can't be the fact that a Tier 3 country is on that list or a Tier 2 watch list, but a Tier 1 is profiting from the trafficking, but nothing's being done about it. And I wanted to talk about one thing in particular. So The Economist, the magazine, recently reported that the world's most valuable commodity is data, overtaking oil. The recent Cambridge Analytica scandal illustrated that with the media response and the subsequent stock market plunge of Facebook, the biggest since 2012, as concerns grew over the social network's handling of user data. Now, I'll point out the relevance in a minute, because the most valuable commodity isn't data, it's human life. So by putting data above human life is insane. And to give you the reason that I was giving you Facebook's nosedive, which is 67 billion pounds wiped off the company's value. Now, if we were to look at Apple, for instance, Apple garnered significant media attention for the work conditions in China. This was disseminated to the public, and they were aware that the work conditions were so dire that people were committing suicide. They were killing themselves because their work conditions were so bad, and nets were put up so they couldn't kill themselves. Now, this was known to the public, so people that read the papers were aware that Apple are not doing enough. Now, Apple were the most valuable company in the world, second at the moment. So it shows the significant difference in how public perception towards trafficking and data is. Data, your own data. I think the important thing in terms of response would be to quote a management consultant, Peter Drucker, which is culture eats strategy for breakfast. The important thing here is to change the culture, not simply to find responses to problems that will be displaced, or it'll be simply change how it's occurring. And I wanted to give you one more example of just how this plays in. So there's something that a lot of people would have heard about, the General Data Protection Regulation. That's coming into force on the 25th of May, and it's causing corporate panic. The fines for non-compliance is 4% of annual turnover, or up to 10 million euros. So companies are taking notice. But I want to give you an example of a real-life situation, but it's a hypothetical situation that is going to happen. So if you were to buy a pair of shoes from a company and they were to send you an unsolicited marketing email, that would then give rise to an investigation by the regulators for non-compliance. You could have your own lawsuit, and it would lose share values once this becomes apparent or it garners media attention. However, the shoes that are being made in Bangladesh, that, for instance, if it is Bangladesh, that particular person could be is most likely to be in a situation of forced servitude, and his remedies are non-existent, and the companies have no real onus or incentive to do anything about it. If it is found that somewhere up the supply chain that this is occurring, they would be justified legally to simply publish a statement saying, "We're sorry, we'll make sure it never happens again." So that's my kind of talk. It's relatively brief because I didn't have time to prepare as much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Really helpful.
If Chief Counsel or Justices would like to speak to anything you've just heard, please do.
Yes, it's very good. Thank you very much for coming. That's been extremely helpful. And first of all, I'd ask if the registrar could also keep a note of the 4 different distinctions that you've made so far as slavery go, and the fact that each of those do require different responses. I think that's going to be very important for us in our process, and thank you for that methodical approach. Just 3 questions, one of which would be, what would be your advice as to potential amendments to the Modern Slavery Act?
An increase in sanctions. I mean, if it's an equivalent of preventing money laundering, if you increase the sanctions, at the moment there's no fines, no criminal, no imprisoned custodial sentences. I mean, it's a very simple amendment. I think it was deliberately omitted. Mm-hmm. It's not by chance. Corporations, because the compliance officers within companies, they're not really looking at slavery. But if they're suddenly now, there are sanctions, there are criminal liability. So if you were to know that something's going on in a country that you're dealing with, just like in bribery, if bribery occurs in another country and you have a subsidiary in the UK, you could be forced into bankruptcy. I mean, the fines are incredible.
So do you think? Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah.
So do you think that the corporations themselves derive their wealth, therefore, from slavery, and
100%. 100%. Yeah.
So, but for the fact that that there was slavery involved, or indentured employment was actually involved in the process, those companies would not be able to maintain profit.
Well, we know that. Yeah, I mean,
how do we know that?
Well, Apple, just from Apple's the example I gave you about Apple, people aren't killing themselves at work because they have a good work-life balance. It's a very secure location. There's security guards. There's people at the time going up and down, making sure everybody's doing their bit. No breaks, no holidays. The hours are not going to correspond with our employment law at all.
So you started to allude towards the end there, and I don't in any way wish to lead you after saying that I didn't really want the council to lead as well, but just to point you in the direction. Would it be right to say that you are suggesting that shareholders themselves have some kind of a say in relation to corporations?
Well, I think that relates to culture, because really, if you're aware that this is happening, as you would do for bribery or for any other offence, the stock or just the recent Cambridge Analytica, the value of the company goes down, investors pull out. It's the culture. People don't really care. So the importance is to, make people care, raising awareness.
Do you think that's are you pointing towards corporate activism as being a way of actually dealing with this, where shareholders band together, or is that?
I mean, that is. Going? I mean, the Act is suggesting that. It's just not robust enough. It's diluted. It's weak, but it does show that it's about supply chain intervention and due diligence.
Okay, just a final question, just to assist from your personal experience, which seems extensive and be very useful here. How do we create a society in which, in your opinion, we value human life more than oil pipes or data?
Well, I think one of the main issues that I found is drugs, murder, rape, sex. These resonate in the media, but there's some sort of reason why trafficking doesn't. Trafficking isn't really newsworthy because it just weans away. So I think we have to understand from the individual level, psychologically, why they're not connecting with trafficking. So why were they not doing that? I think we need to understand the psychology. What is it about people that are far away that means that they're that dissimilar to us that we shouldn't care about them? So I didn't answer your question fully.
No, but that was a fair answer. And I want to take you also, because this is just a commission, and maybe this is not your area of strength, into human trafficking, but also about child sex abuse as well. Why don't we care about them?
I think this child sex abuse is a difficult issue because in India, for instance, there's a shame attached to it, and the victims aren't really willing to come forward. So most crimes need a victim. Every crime is victim-led. So if the victims aren't motivated to make the allegation or make people aware, and the people that they're making the allegation aware to are not acting or sweeping it under the carpet, or I think again it's culture, because it's ingrained. I mean, I know from in India, in families it occurs a lot, and we're encouraged, or not me so much, but people are encouraged to just keep them away from that person. That's the approach that's taken, not hold on a minute, this guy's doing this, he needs to be punished.
So it goes back to your cultural point. Okay, but I'll give way to my own friend.
If I may, this iPhone has 2 or 3 dead Chinese in it, because China is the only place where it's legal to put your hands into a Class A carcinogenic in the process of processing computer parts for this iPhone, which means that they die of leukemia very quickly. I would like to ask you, my impression is that we don't treat victims with enough respect, that we don't believe them. But I'd like to ask your opinion of what the culture is with respect to treating victims when they come forward with stories.
Well, I mean, there's different areas. So one of the areas I'm actually quite very familiar with, and that's victim-led research. So I'm currently involved in a AI project whereby basically what we're doing is it's geospatial software. So in Libya there's government-run detention camps and there's non-government-run detention camps. Now the government-run detention camps aren't great, obviously, but the non-government detention camps are where the human rights abuses, the slave auctions occur. So a lot of the people at the government-run militia centres, detention centres, double job, and that's how they make their money. So a lot of what we're developing at the moment, and I think we're at the final stages, is geospatial software that allows victims of human trafficking to locate, discover and label hotspots of human trafficking in near real-time satellite images with the help of deep learning mission vision techniques. So a former slave in Libya can use the application to locate, through an intuitive and easy-to-use interface, the detention centre where they were held hostage. And that solves one particular type of victim, but I'm assuming that you're alluding to the sexual side as well. And I think we should, in the same way that the presumption of innocence is made when somebody's accused of a crime, I think all allegations should be taken to be made in good faith.
Councillor, thank you very much indeed. Very grateful for this, and hopefully we can chase you up.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Just give us 3 minutes, and we will switch seats with you. And,
yes, of course, yeah.
And your esteemed colleague. We've also been joined this afternoon by an eminent barrister at law, Barnaby Hone, Tristone Chambers, Focus, Asset Recovery, Extradition, and I'm sure a great more else beside. Councillor, kindly give us a little brief background on yourself and then speak to whatever it is you wish to address to this court. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I am a specialist in international asset recovery, so in simple terms, I take criminals' money and return it to its rightful owner, or to compensate the victims. That is a specialty I have developed over the last 8 years. A lot of that has been concentrated in my work both in the Caribbean, in Africa, and throughout the world. The United Kingdom has a particularly well-developed form of law that is in respect of that, but a lot of countries do have laws which allow criminals to have money taken away from them and returned to the public purse. That was the original law was developed in Australia, and it's been followed both in America, throughout the Commonwealth, and in Europe. Bulgaria and Romania being two particular countries that do that. I've also been able to draft laws in certain countries for asset recovery, including the British Virgin Islands and Kosovo. And I'm here to talk to you today about the impact that might have on human trafficking, because I'm afraid from my experience it is not used as an effective weapon at this stage. I'll get on to what I think are maybe the reasons behind that. But to set out what is the basis of asset recovery, there are two forms. First is the criminal aspect of asset recovery. You can have asset recovery versus the person has had a debt for their criminal lifestyle they've had. So if you have a drug dealer, he is calculated of how much money he's made, and that is his benefit, and he's asked to pay that back, and that's personal. Or you can forfeit items that are used during the criminality. So it might be forfeiting items that are used or made directly out of the criminality, but there had to be a link with that. And in criminal confiscation, there is always a conviction. The other form is civil asset recovery, which I will suggest is a very good tool in these circumstances. And due to the rise of and the difficulty in prosecuting all cases, you've had a rise in civil asset recovery, and that's on the balance of probabilities, where an asset rather than a personal debt. So, for instance, say a property has been gained through unlawful conduct, that can then be recovered. Money in a bank account has been gained through unlawful conduct, that can be recovered, and cash. And it is that method which, because it is a lower standard than the criminal standard, allows the disruption of crime. And, as we know, a lot of human trafficking is done for profit. That is the main motivation. So if you can take that profit away from the crime, if you can disrupt it and lower the profit margins, you disincentivize it. But the other point is, with the money you recover, you can use it to fund the fight against human trafficking. You can use it to fund that work and to help the victims. This has been done effectively in the war on drugs. I hate the phrase the war on drugs, but I think that is the media phrase, and is being used in anti-wildlife crime at the moment. And I've had a very small part in helping that. But here we have a situation where it can be used effectively. Why is it not being used at the moment? Because human trafficking, as you have probably heard from my small experience, is usually something which is undermining other criminality. It's involved in other criminality. It is not targeted as alone, it is targeted as funding towards either cannabis factories, others, brothels, and other overall criminality, rather than targeting the people who actually do the slavery and then targeting their bank accounts. There is often a lack of training in this area. This area is relatively new. It has been developed over the last 30 years. And in that time, even in the last 8 years when I've been practicing in it, it has developed hugely. It has expanded throughout the world, and it usually takes 5 to 6 years for a country to allow these principles to bed in. Because it's quite strange for a country to have to think, well, I'm going to take all the benefit from somebody. It's a draconian measure. Now, how the courts deal with that in each country is slightly different, but it is and can be seen to be an impinging even on the defendant's human rights, especially if they have not been convicted of a crime. To have the balance of, to have money taken away from them because of a decision on the balance of probabilities, and usually based on evidence which wouldn't be admissible in a criminal trial, is a difficult concept. My experience in the Caribbean, where they had systems which had been brought in place over 5 or 6 years, it was still very much in the fledgling stage. In the United Kingdom and Canada, Australia, New Zealand, it is a bit more developed than that. And some areas of the Caribbean, such as St. Vincent. But in Kenya, though they've had the laws for a while, it hasn't been used hugely. In Bulgaria, it was used quite a lot, and then political considerations might have slowed that progress. So it is also using it, getting the experience in place, and encouraging it. And the other encouragement is both political, but also where the money goes. Using good asset recovery incentivization schemes. Now, I know that is a bit of a mouthful, and I wouldn't ask you to all be tested on that, but we like to call it ARIS. It's a bit easier. Not a Yaris, an ARIS. Now, with ARIS, you then look at a scheme where the money comes back, and you could think of a particular scheme for human trafficking-related crimes to go back into the prosecution. In the United Kingdom, the split is 50% goes to law enforcement, 50% to the Home Office. The 50% that goes into the government for schemes could go into human trafficking, or be earmarked for that type of work. Also, the money recovered would incentivize police officers and prosecutors to do that work, or at least be funded in that. That is not necessarily much a consideration in a country which has a decent amount of funding, but it is particularly a consideration in countries where there isn't the funding available. So I'll ask you to consider those as points. My experience in all these countries is that human trafficking is a problem, but it is a problem which is seen as a secondary problem to the overall criminality, and that might be an education point. I don't think there's a lack of faith there, and good faith, but there might be a lack of motivation and focus. That is all I wish to say, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor. If either Chief Counsel and or the Justices would like to speak to anything, please do so now.
Working on the balance of probabilities in the civil forfeiture thing, is there a greater risk of unfairness if someone is, say, politically targeted for political reasons, for that person then to become prey to the person seeking the asset forfeiture?
Quite simply, yes, there is that as a problem, and that is an issue in some countries. That needs to be tempered with a judiciary which is independent.
Yes.
This is not a perfect tool. I do not know of a case, and I'm not saying it hasn't happened, where that has happened, but mostly this has been brought in where there are independent judiciary and independent prosecutors. It could happen, but often it is also used to tackle corruption, and when any politicians might be in the frame, it is de-empowered sometimes.
Yes.
The use in in the United Kingdom have brought in unexplained wealth orders, which are to target and politically exposed people outside of Europe who might have links to property which is unexplained and targeting corruption, but that has to be balanced to gain political motivations.
Yes.
to an answer. I'm sorry to be long-winded, Chief Justice.
No.
Yes, is the answer, but it needs to be balanced.
Yes.
And it also does, it can be focused in the wording of the statutes. So a lot of them can have a type of criminality, or it has to be in this broad type of criminality. That doesn't necessarily stop it being used politically focused,
No.
but it might sometimes slow it down and make it for what it is.
Well, countries fall into different categories. Countries where it's safe to be an innocent person, and other countries where it is unsafe to be an innocent person, but politically unpopular.
Okay, I'm obliged for that. Just looking for an example, because I think you've actually thrown up quite an interesting solution that I think as an inquiry we need to explore a little bit more. Let's look at a hypothetical example. So, for example, a situation occurs in Lithuania where there's young ladies who are picked up from the street, they're brought over to, say, the UK or to the United States, their passports are taken away, they're forced into brothels. In a situation like that, could an organisation that's a non-governmental organisation be the plaintiff in a civil court in which the people who were nominally or seem to have benefited from trafficking were the defendants? And in that instance of a civil case, would it be possible that the beneficiaries of a successful civil action were the victims, or would it be that it would be the organisation itself that would be the beneficiary and then distribute to the victims or to the cause, or would it be the state itself?
Or some combination.
Or yeah, Bob, just helping us with the answer to
No,
that.
indeed. This type of law couldn't be used or is yet to be given to anybody who are non-state actors. A person could sue, an organisation could sue under the civil law and recover it. But if it's a non-state actor and using a civil recovery power, that means they don't have the safeguards that a public body has. Safeguards such as being able to oversight, having a decision-making tree that allows them to be publicly open for that decision. And that also then verges into potentially having one body or bodies suing each other and trying to recover each other, which could lead to, though it would be very well-mannered, or very well-meaning, sorry, not well-mannered, I'm not saying it.
Well-mannered, they
might be well-mannered.
Let's hope they're well-meaning, yeah?
But it might be well-meaning, but it would not necessarily be end up in the way that manner it was supposed to. So this needs to be state-run, even if it is an international body, potentially, or the funds are agreed through an international treaty. Most states have these powers, and in that situation, if the profits or any money that was generated from that brothel could be seized, some of that money using either from bank accounts or the cash that is generated, and then some of it could go back into compensation potentially, some of it could go back into the unit which did the seizing.
Yeah, exactly. So you're suggesting that if in a situation such as that, if I understand you correctly, that it would be this for the state to in some way be involved, or at least be the beneficiary, and that they would also be the ones that would then guide the enforcement, and they could use money for enforcement or for compensation as per whatever the state said that it was going to do with it. But it's a state solution.
Exactly, and it is for us to put hopefully pressure on the state so that it is used in a manner which continues the fight. Because if you don't have direct funding into this area, or it is used in certain ways, it'll just go into a general pot, and matters might not be incentivised.
And counsel, is that based on your experience, or is that based on the law?
That is based on my experience outside of the United Kingdom.
Okay.
Outside of the United
Sorry, counsel, I can see you.
No. There's another commissioner next to you.
Sorry, yes. I noticed in your remarks you seem to implicate that lack of money often impedes justice. You have to wait and see if you can get some money in to put the money back to try and bring more people to justice. Could I just perhaps make a reminder that what I said before, every sovereign nation can create, issue and control all the money it needs based on its wealth. And in fact, it is the money creation globally that is holding back justice and that's allowing so much of this abuse and slavery to happen.
If I may, I find this is absolutely fascinating, and since you have specifically said that your experience is outside the United Kingdom, it may be that you don't care to offer an opinion. I've seen a number of documents that call into question the data integrity of particular documents that are submitted by anonymous plaintiffs, and the safeguards seem to be based on self-regulation rather than any actual oversight, to the point that those people who are bonded against being guilty of malpractice are actually never held accountable. Have you seen any possibilities of that existing within any country where it's possible to, for example, create a fabricated claim against someone and drive them into bankruptcy and the whole system just accepts all of those documents?
I haven't through the work that I have done, but I work in a particular area where there's a lot of integrity in the investigations, but also that type of abuse would be hard to happen. That doesn't mean it couldn't happen, and I've always thought that if you say it couldn't happen, it almost certainly will under your nose.
Elegant answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect timing. It's 6:10. Councillor, thank you very much for joining us. Greatly appreciated. Justices, Your Grace, Chief Counsel, Commissioners, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming today to the plenary seating of the International Tribunal for Natural Justice's Judicial Commission of Inquiry into Human Trafficking and Child Sex Abuse. Tomorrow's seating takes place at 10 a.m. sharp.
We are the power behind the ITNJ. Add your voice. Sign the treaty.